Domain expansions, one of the highest displays of skills in JJK. It is undoubtedly the ultimate signature move for someone to possess in JJK. And you're watching this video because you're wondering what are domain expansions exactly, and whose is the strongest. Well, today we'll be ranking and explaining all domain expansions throughout JJK. Now I'm going to do a manga spoiler warning now. This is going to include a lot of domain expansions that are yet to be adapted, and even if it's ones that we've already seen, I'm also going to be pulling from discussion later in the manga, so it may spoil some aspects of the domain expansion or story, so if you're anime only, this might not be the video for you. In addition, I won't be including anything from Modulo, just as there's only been one new domain expansion, which we also haven't seen much detail of, and I don't really care about Dabura. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So before we start the ranking, what are domain expansions and how can you defend yourself against them? Domain expansions are considered to be the pinnacle of strength in terms of Jujutsu sorcery. It's an advanced barrier technique, where to use it you usually have to do a unique hand sign, say domain expansion, and then the name of it. This results in the user casting their innate domain into a barrier technique, with said barrier technique having a curse technique embedded into it, resulting in the user's curse technique gaining a significant boost in power, as well as a guaranteed hit effect. However, domain expansions aren't usually the same at all, as there's subcategories that I'd split them up into, those being a lethal complete domain expansion, a lethal incomplete domain expansion, and then a non-lethal domain expansion. A lethal complete domain expansion is the much more commonly seen domain expansion. This is where it meets all the previous criteria, in that the user is able to successfully cast a barrier technique with their curse technique embedded into it, giving them a guaranteed hit effect as well as a boost to the curse technique output. Then a lethal incomplete domain expansion is similar, however it's usually incomplete because the user isn't able to embed their curse technique into the barrier successfully, thus they lose out on the short hit effect, but they do still get a boost to their curse technique output. A non-lethal domain expansion is still a sorcerer embedding a curse technique into a barrier technique. However, rather than doing physical damage with the short hit effect, the short hit effect aspect in this scenario forces those within the domain expansion to abide by the curse technique's rules, and additionally normally has a stipulation like non-combativeness, or all the information about the domain expansion is given to them. So for some quick examples, a complete and lethal domain expansion is Gojo's Unlimited Void, a lethal and incomplete domain expansion would be Megumi's Chimera Shadow Garden, and then a good example of a non-lethal would be Higuruma's domain expansion. So how can you even counter them? To be brief, there's only 3 possible ways to counter a domain expansion, with 2 of which being classified as anti-domain expansion techniques, those being Simple Domain as well as Hollow Wicker Basket, both in which establish a mini-complete domain barrier around them, pretty much because it's not the barrier that's nearest around you that neutralizes the short hit factor from the domain expansion's barrier. However, it's important to note that it can't counter an incomplete domain expansion, as the ability for the incomplete domain expansion isn't successfully embedded into a barrier technique. Therefore, without that guaranteed hit effect being embedded into the barrier, the use of a barrier to block the other barrier is null and void because there is no barrier to protect it from. And you're wondering what's the final way to defend yourself? It's by opening your own domain expansion. See, when there's 2 domain expansions casted, they enter what's called a domain clash, in which whichever one is more refined will win and conquer the other, and the speed of which one conquers the other is dependent on how much more refined one domain expansion is compared to the other. The 2 best examples to display the difference would be Megumi vs Dagon, where Megumi's able to hold a little bit of space within Dagon's domain expansion using his own, but if he gave it another probably 20 minutes, Megumi would have lost that clash. And then Jogo and Gojo, where pretty much as soon as Gojo opened his domain expansion, because it's so much more refined, he won pretty much instantaneously. Nevertheless, this is considered the best defense to a domain expansion though. But with the baseline explanation of domain expansions and counters out of the way, I also want to give a shout out to a couple honorable mentions from a few characters that are going to appear in the anime soon, that being Ryu and Yuro. See, Ryu and Yuro are seemingly very powerful sorcerers, with very strong curse techniques at that, and given Kenjaku's packs are usually with very strong sorcerers because he needs as much curse energy as possible for his plan, it wouldn't be crazy to think their domain expansions are also strong. However, given the domain expansions never shown due to the unique scenario of a 3-way clash of domain expansions, I can't just blindly place them on the list. So for that reason, they're going to stick as an honorable mention. Okay, but getting into it now, coming in at number 14 on our list, we have the Smallpox Deity's Graveyard domain expansion. See, the Smallpox Deity is a special grade curse spirit who has a condition-based domain expansion in which you put in a casket and then Tombstone hits you and pushes you into the ground. If you're trapped in the ground for more than 3 seconds, you get smallpox and die from it, which in theory could be useful against scrubs. See, Mei, a grade 1 sorcerer, was able to deduce what the conditions were and consistently break herself out, as well as identify that the curse spirit always targeted whoever had the highest amount of curse energy, allowing for Mei to use a rather simple strategy to defeat it, all in its own domain. Now, this may not be an upscale for Mei, and it may just be that the Smallpox Deity is stupid. However, you can't really justify losing in your own domain like that. So for that reason, it's the weakest domain expansion we've seen in JJK. This next one has a bit of potential to be a little controversial, but coming in at number 13 on our ranking of domain expansions, we have Megumi's domain expansion. expansion, Chimera Shadow Garden. Now look, the 10 Shadows itself is a crazy strong curse technique with a lot of upside, and the same could be said about Megumi's domain expansion. Eventually, see Megumi's domain expansion casts the shadows to fill the space around him, resulting in a huge buff to his 10 Shadows curse technique, but it's just not developed enough throughout the series, and it has a few cons that, to be frank, outweigh the positive of buffing his 10 Shadows technique. The first and much more apparent con, in my opinion, has to be the fact that it's an incomplete domain expansion. See, because Megumi's not very good at barrier techniques, he isn't able to make the barrier around his domain expansion that allows him to embed his curse technique into it and get that guaranteed hit effect. And that's already a major blow in terms of the benefits of opening a domain expansion, considering how much curse energy and how taxing it is on someone to open one. And it does mean Megumi can cast Shikigami from anywhere within his domain expansion, which is pretty cool. He also gets a good win condition that if someone doesn't reinforce their feet with curse energy to stay above the shadows, and then they fall into it, they'll suffocate as a result. But another con of this is anything that falls into his shadows, he has to carry the weight up, which can only really be a hindrance to him. And because of that and the no guaranteed hit effect, I'd say 90% of the time Megumi's better off not opening his domain expansion. And if you can say that about a domain expansion, can it really rank that high? Especially since the remainder of the list consists of domain expansions that consistently only provide a benefit at worst. Hence why I've had to put it at 13. Coming up next, however, we have the domain expansion that would have conquered Megumi's. We have Dagon's domain expansion, Horizon of the Captivating Skonda. Look, naturally, since Megumi was only able to hold a mini puddle of his own domain expansion in Dagon's domain expansion just naturally has to be at least one up from Megumi's. But yes, Dagon's domain expansion is a nice palm tree beach with a nice blue ocean. It is a complete and lethal domain expansion, which means Dagon has successfully created a barrier technique with his curse technique embedded into it, giving him that sure hit effect. And Dagon's sure hit effect is Fish Shikigami, in which those fish eat the flesh of whoever it attacks. But in addition to that, what makes it more strong is that the Shikigami only appear when they're about to make contact with the person, making it nearly impossible to be able to react in time. And realistically, Dagon should have beat Maki, Nabito, Nanami, and Megumi, because he had them on the ropes in his domain expansion, and if it went for Plot and Toji flying in, Dagon probably would have cleaned them up. But unfortunately, Dagon is the weakest Disaster Curse Spirit, and naturally, a stronger Disaster Curse Spirit in Jogo is going to place higher in our ranking. So yes, coming in at number 11 on our ranking of strongest domain expansions, we have Jogo's Coffin of the Iron Mountain. See, Jogo's a really strong curse spirit, probably like top 3 strongest curse spirits we see. See, Jogo's the curse spirit of volcanoes, meaning he's derived from the fear and anxiety around volcanic eruption, meaning his curse technique subsequently is a lot of lava, smoke, fire, anything that will be in a volcanic eruption, which alone is a really strong technique. But his domain expansion goes one step further. It brings him and whoever's caught in his domain expansion into the middle of an active volcano, which would leave any middle rung sorcerer or lower likely to burn to death pretty much instantly. And again, given it's a complete lethal domain expansion, he's able to project lava and fire at people with a guaranteed hit effect. But unfortunately for Jogo, he's always cursed to fight the strongest. See, he accidentally becomes the scale of how powerful someone is. As given in Shibuya, he absolutely sparks Nanami, Nabito, and Maki in one touch each, which is a pretty good feat considering there's 2 first grade sorcerers and 1 person being considered to be a first grade sorcerer. And despite Jogo himself being a special grade cursed spirit, he's a really good example to show that generally are levels even within special grades. See, he's pinned against the 2 strongest sorcerers of all time both times he's given a major fight. Him, unfortunately, running into Gojo the first time, with Gojo blocking his guaranteed hit effect just by intensifying his infinity, and then Gojo opening his domain expansion, destroying Jogo's in seconds, and then just pulling his head off. However, we aren't going into Gojo's domain expansion just yet, as next up at number 10, and major spoiler warning in advance, a lot of the entries from here on out are going to be manga spoilers, because again, they're either not shown or the discussion will include manga spoilers. But yes, moving on, we have Naoya Zenin's Time Cell Moon Palace coming in at number 10. Okay, to be frank, every domain expansion from here on out is going to be incredibly powerful, and Naoya's domain expansion is absolutely no exemption to this. See, upon Naoya's return as a vengeful cursed spirit, he is pushed to his limits again by Maki and Co. But this results in Naoya using his domain expansion for the first time, creating a black abyss with a flash-like platform leading to him and a massive eye, with his short hit effect being frames of animation that cut and slice people. Further, the curse technique embedded into the barrier is projection sorcery, which again, everyone within the domain expansion and detected by it has to abide by the rules of projection sorcery. And if they're unable to abide by the rules, just like if you break the rules of projection sorcery outside of a domain expansion, you become a freeze frame, thus leaving you extremely vulnerable to the animation cuts, as well as just any blow from Naoya. But being cut by these frames of animation are shown to even be able to cut off someone's hand. See, this domain expansion is already really strong, because the concept of Naoya is already one of the fastest sorcerers we've seen, probably like top 10 comfortably. It's able to enforce the rules of projection sorcery on everyone without touching them, which just results in these poor souls not being able to follow the rules properly, being frozen and getting cut from his frames of animation. So yes, despite Molten Lava being quite powerful, the enhancement of Naoya's technique from opening his domain expansion is so significant, giving him a long distance attack in a traditionally close combat curse technique, in addition to projection sorcery being the embedded curse technique, makes it in my opinion one of the biggest buffs the domain expansion gives someone. Unfortunately, despite this extraordinary buff, it had to deal with Maki, who's undetectable in a domain expansion, resulting killing, and Naoya just getting stabbed through the chest. But moving on, at number 9 we have another insanely powerful domain expansion, with Yorozu's domain expansion, Threefold Affliction. See, Yorozu's domain expansion is a complete and lethal domain expansion, with Yorozu's curse technique construction being embedded into the barrier, in which just means anything Yorozu constructs and then launches will hit whoever's in the domain. And in this case, in the battle against Sukuna, Yorozu constructs her most powerful move, a True Sphere. Oh, what's so powerful about a True Sphere, you're asking? Well, actually, it's arguably one of the most powerful moves in the series. See, a True Sphere has a zero contact area around the whole sphere, meaning as a result, all the force is concentrated into a singular point, resulting in near infinite pressure at the contact point and resulting in it obliterating anything it touches, which is absolutely insane if you think about it, because it becomes insensitive to whether or not someone or something has strong durability. And this is what was applied to the guaranteed hit effect. Pretty much meaning if you don't have an anti-domain technique, as soon as Yorozu lets go of this True Sphere, you will just die. But unfortunately for Yorozu, she's matched up with Sukuna in Megumi's body, who's tamed Maharaga. And throughout their battle in the lead up to Yorozu's domain expansion, Sukuna had been taking the burden of adaptation for Maharaga, in which he's adapting to the metal liquid component that Yorozu uses to make anything, which luckily enough for Sukuna and then unlucky for Yorozu, results in Maharaga being completely adapted to the curse technique, allowing for Sukuna to summon Maharaga, and Maharaga just cut the sphere in half, which Maharaga then proceeds to cut her down because she's in shock, which in turn shatters the domain instantly. See, as the domain expansion is from someone's innate domain, and because Yorozu got severely injured, whose inner strength and concentration, which are all important to maintaining a domain expansion, had been reduced way too far for it to be maintained, resulting in her defeat and ranking it at number 9 on our list. And then moving on to our number 8 spot, and probably my second most controversial placement, we have Akari's domain expansion, Idle Death Gamble. Before I'm found in the comments, I want to make it very clear it's a very strong domain expansion, and for those who don't know what it is, Idle Death Gamble is probably the most confusing ability in the entire series. See, it's based upon a real-life pachinko machine, and the theme for this machine is a romance manga, in which the objective for Akari is to win the jackpot in the pachinko machine, and winning the jackpot, like any slot machine, is lining up the same number multiple times, and in this case 3 times. See, the user has to partake in the flow of the game to hit the jackpot, in which the user starts on a normal mode in a neutral stage. Then the user is able to use 3 different types of visual effect indicators, those being shuttered doors, reserve balls, and consecutive efforts, in which the user can use shuttered doors and the reserve balls as an offensive tool, and then consecutive efforts are more of a defensive tool through redoing scenes to revert any damage, with all 3 indicators coming in different rarities being depicted by the color in which they appear in, which in order from increasing the jackpot the least to the most are green, red, gold, and rainbow, which if the rainbow indicator occurs 4 more times, it results in the user being guaranteed to hit the jackpot, and the user is able to choose what indicator appears and the rarity. However, the success of it appearing is based upon luck. And then once Akari is able to generate 2 indicators, he can advance the stage to the Ricci stage, which reveals 2 of the 3 numbers needed to hit the jackpot. And while that last slot spins, the Ricci stage reveals a scene from the manga, and it can be one of 4 scenes that occur, in which there's varying chances of the jackpot hitting. And then in order from least likely to most likely, it's the transit card Ricci, where the main character Yuki has to get through the gate and onto the train in time. Doing so will guarantee the jackpot. Then the seat struggle Ricci, which actually hasn't been shown yet, but it is said to have a better chance than the previous. Then there's the potty emergency Ricci, where if Yuki's classmate, who's a bit of an airhead, is able to reach the train station without pissing themselves, it'll trigger a jackpot. And then finally, the most likely scene, which has an 80% chance of hitting the jackpot, is the Friday night final train Ricci, where if Yumi, the main female character of this romance manga, doesn't make the train on the platform across from Yuki, and then reappears after the train departs, jackpot is again triggered. If in any scenario the jackpot isn't triggered, the 1 in 239 chance reduces by 1, so in this case it goes down to 1 in 238. Keep in mind this is accounting for no indicators being hit. In addition, the first redo and returning to the normal stage results in an instant 20% chance of hitting the jackpot. And what's so good about hitting this jackpot? Well, if you don't already know, it grants Akari infinite curse energy, with the entire duration of the song Admiring You, which is 4 minutes and 11 seconds to be exact. And with this infinite curse energy, it greatly buffs his body, making his physical ability incredible. But the most insane ability granted from unlimited curse energy would have to be him unlocking reverse curse technique reflexively, as in order for him to be continuously given infinite curse energy, his body has to be in prime condition to be able to hold it in. So if he's injured, such as having his arm cut off, his body will reflexively perform extremely high levels of reverse curse technique and grow it back pretty much instantaneously, which is insane. And to be frank, it's the best display of reverse curse technique in the series, with even Yorame going on to say it's better than Gojo and Sukuna's reverse curse technique. But then once the song ends, his curse technique's restored, meaning he can just open his domain expansion again instantly. But he also gets extra buffs. See, depending on the number that won the jackpot, whether it's even or odd, even numbers result in an increased speed of spins, and odd numbers resulting in starting off in an increased state of probability off rip. And then in addition to all this, there's also the slight possibility that the stage starts in hidden probability, which essentially is a combination of both the benefits. But yes, that's Akari's overly convoluted and overly complicated domain expansion explained, which is undeniably one of the strongest domain expansions in the series, even if only for the immortality factor. However, I just believe the rest of the domain expansions are stronger and less dependent on conditions lining up perfectly. So unfortunately, that's why it's coming in at number 8 on my list. And onto a less contentiously placed one, we have Higuruma's domain expansion, Deadly Sentencing. See, this is probably one of the coolest curse techniques / abilities in the series in my opinion. See, Deadly Sentencing brings Higuruma and those within his domain's radius into a courtroom in a non-lethal domain expansion, and in this domain expansion combat's forbidden, and then there's a trial that will be held where the targeted person in the domain expansion will be the defendant. It replicates a court hearing, with Higuruma being the prosecutor and the Shikigami judgeman being the judge. Judgment will then present the charges to the defendant, with the defendant and prosecutor both being given the chance to make their statements, with the defendant going first. Then the prosecutioner gets a chance of rebuttal. However, they're also given a piece of evidence by judgment. However, it's important to note that the evidence doesn't have to be conclusive and that it won't be shared with the defendant until after the prosecutor makes their statement. And upon both arguments' conclusions, judgment will make a lawful ruling based purely upon the arguments made by both the prosecutor and defendant. Because as seen, even though judgment knows everything about everyone within the domain expansion, thus knowing that Yuji wasn't in control of his body in Shibuya and that Sukuna was, because Yuji straight up confessed to it all, Judgeman ruled him guilty. The punishments that Judgeman can impose are one of two things. One being confiscation, which is where Judgeman temporarily makes it impossible for a sorcerer to use their curse technique or the curse energy if they don't have a curse technique. And then two, there's death penalty, which also important to note, it's always been used in conjunction with confiscation. But yes, death penalty grants Higuruma the Executioner's Sword, in which his gavel turns into a bright sword, that if the user cuts the guilty person with it, no matter how shallow the cut is, the guilty person will die as a result. And the emphasis here is that the guilty person dies. So for instances when there's multiple souls within a body, aka Yuji when he first fights Higuruma, and then Megumi when he fights Higuruma later, as both of them have Sukuna in their body, the guilty soul within the body, whether it's the host or the soul residing in the body, will be the one who dies from the cut inflicted. Meaning coming out of Higuruma's domain expansion, he's granted a one-hit kill ability, and then as well for 99% of the time, plot armor, confiscation takes away the technique of the sorcerer he's fighting, making them extremely vulnerable and unable to defend themselves as well. So for that reason, I'm having to place it this high above all the other ones, because given that win condition and someone having their ability stripped away temporarily, it's just too strong of a combination. But moving on to our next spot, coming in at number 6, we have Mahito's domain expansion, self-embodiment of perfection. See, by using mini hand signs within his mouth, Mahito summons his domain expansion, which is kind of like a dark abyss with a bunch of hands around. See, Mahito's innate technique, soul manipulation, is already an at most two-touch kill technique, which is absurdly powerful as is, especially given all that's needed to activate the curse technique is touching someone and then being able to distort their soul because of it. His domain expansion giving him the ability to do that remotely is just insane. Pretty much if you get trapped within his domain expansion, it's an instant win condition for him, unless you have anti-domain techniques up your sleeve, but even then you'll be fighting to not give up your anti-domain technique and not have Mahito touch you within his domain expansion anyway, which forces people to have to play extremely defensive in a fight against Mahito. But then unfortunately for Mahito, he just had the misfortune of having to fight his perfect counterpart for the majority of his fights, and that being Yuji. See, because Yuji's able to target the soul with his strikes, and because you can't kill Mahito unless you can obliterate him in one shot, or if you can target his soul. See, because Mahito is always able to heal his body through reshaping his soul first, and then that results in healing his body. So having the misfortune of running into Yuji, who can target the soul directly, who then also has Sukuna inside of him, so Mahito is not able to open his domain expansion without getting killed by Sukuna, it results in him getting dog-walked in Shibuya by Yuji. But given his win condition being, you better not have an anti-domain technique, I have to rank him this high. But moving on to our next spot, and it's probably the most controversial spot on the list, especially considering I said we won't be discussing anything modulo, we have Yuji's domain expansion, in which we don't even know the name of. But yes, Yuji opens his domain expansion through a similar hand sign to Sukuna, and then it replicates his hometown in which he grew up in, but more specifically places within his hometown that hold strong memories to Yuji. It's a seemingly peaceful and non-violent domain expansion. However, the sure hit effect is a dismantle that targets the soul. This instantly in my mind putting it at worst on par with Mahito's domain expansion, as they're both guaranteed hits to the soul that can kill, Yuji being so confident in this fact that he straight up says to Sukuna's face, I can kill you whenever I want, which is an insane feat and a testament to how strong a soul-cutting dismantle is. And although it wasn't without the help of Nobara, who stunned Sukuna and got rid of his anti-domain technique, Yuji did follow through with his words. With a combination of black flashes and soul-cutting dismantles, Yuji defeats Sukuna. And for that reason, Yuji's domain expansion just has to be top 5, even without discussing his modulo feats. And despite having one of the highest upsides to a domain expansion in the series, it'd be too outrageous even for me to put him any higher. Coming in at number 4, we have Kenjaku's Wound Profusion. Kenjaku's domain expansion calls out a tomb-like statue featuring cursed spirits' faces all over it, and then rather than it being an enclosed domain expansion, Kenjaku's domain expansion is one of 2 domain expansions that have an open barrier technique, which essentially is manifesting a domain expansion into the surrounding space of the battle, all within a certain radius of the user. This meaning, although it is technically open, it is a completed barrier technique, and with it being escapable technically, it significantly boosts the curse technique embedded into the domain much more than an enclosed domain expansion would. And to be able to do this, it's considered an extremely high level of Jujutsu sorcery, which makes sense given Kenjaku's hundreds of years old, and Sukuna being the only other phenom to be able to do this. This just speaking volumes to Kenjaku's mastery of his domain expansion. And the most interesting part to me is, Kenjaku's domain expansion at least visually resembles Geto's curse technique. However, the ability that's applied to it in terms of a guaranteed hit effect, it's Kaori, aka Yuji's mum's curse technique, which the reversal of it is what's being applied. And given that Yuji's mum's curse technique was anti-gravity, the curse technique being applied to the barrier was gravity, resulting with anyone in the domain having the gravity around them amplified, which in itself is insane. But also, it's not unreasonable to presume that Kenjaku can swap what curse technique is embedded into the barrier at will. See, Yuki estimated in a worst case scenario that Kenjaku was able to hold up to 4 curse techniques at a time before his brain became mush. But at the time of the fight against Yuki, only 3 are known, those being Kenjaku's body hopping technique, curse spirit manipulation, and Kaori's anti-gravity technique. I personally think the 4th slot's empty because he had to use Art of Transfiguration, which he can only use once, so unless he's found a curse spirit's technique that he can permanently copy, I don't think he has a 4th one in his bag at the moment. In which, all of this on top of having over 1,000 years lived experience, given he was probably around in the Heian era since he knew Sukuna, and only being second to Tengen when it comes to barrier techniques, which are no snub for being second to Tengen considering Tengen controls all the barriers in Japan. With these 2 things in mind, I can only imagine Kenjaku losing a domain expansion clash if it's through raw power and ability over refinement, because if it came to who's more efficient and more refined, it'd be pretty hard to imagine someone who has enough experience to understand their own domain expansion more than Kenjaku knows his. Hence why it'd be insanity in my opinion to have it anywhere outside of your top 4. Now moving on though, coming in at number 3, we have Yuta's domain expansion, Authentic Mutual Love. Yuta's domain expansion brings him and those around him into a vast open space filled with crosses and katanas. And Yuta's domain expansion is insanely overpowered in my opinion, because Yuta can pick from any curse technique he's ever copied to be the guaranteed hit effect, which is already insane to think about considering he's probably copied over 100 techniques, let alone him being able to choose Hana's curse technique, Jacob's Ladder, which if you don't know, nullifies all curse techniques and objects. And on top of that being the guaranteed hit effect, whenever Yuta picks up a katana, he gets the ability to use a copy technique that's embedded in the katana, but he can only use it once per katana. He also doesn't know what curse techniques in each katana. However, despite that, the curse techniques that Yuta copies tends to be quite powerful, and on top of Yuta not even knowing what technique he's about to use, it makes him even more unpredictable when he's fighting someone, which really he's just looking to put enough pressure that you let up your anti-domain technique so Jacob's Ladder can hit you, which is just insane to think about already, because imagine if Yuta's hitting you with a combo of Jacob's Ladder and then dismantle. That's insane. And to be frank, Yuta and Yuji should have won in his domain. They had Sukuna compromised and a golden opportunity to separate Megumi and Sukuna, but because of plot armor and Megumi being emo again, he rejected being saved and got Yuta hit with a world-cutting slash because of it. Even with his domain's immense power though, it's kind of impossible to have anyone else besides these 2 in the top 2. And look, in my opinion, these 2 are interchangeable, but for the sake of having a ranking, I have Sukuna's domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine, coming in at 2nd. See, like Kenjaku, Sukuna is able to expand his domain in an open barrier style, which he uses in a Binding Vow-esque way to purposely increase the range of it as well as the strength of it, given that people can escape technically. And then within Sukuna's domain, he's also able to launch unlimited amp slashes, consisting of both cleave and dismantle, both of which have the guaranteed hit effect. And he also gets the ability to nominate which slash attacks what. For example, when he uses it in Shibuya, which creates a mini crater mind you after slashing up half the city and then using Fuga, he purposely elects to use cleave, the strongest slash, on things with curse energy, and then dismantle on things without curse energy. This can last until everything is completely turned to dust. And note, he can pick between the slashes and Fuga to be the guaranteed hit, as he's shown using Fuga as the guaranteed hit in his domain expansion in the last fight in Shinjuku when he's fighting and he kills Chozo with it. See, all of this makes Sukuna's domain expansion incredibly powerful and able to most of the time kill anyone instantly, even destroying Gojo's domain expansion multiple times. See, Sukuna would purposely expand his range past Gojo's domain expansion so that he was able to attack it from the outside where it's considered weaker and break it. And despite being able to do that twice, leaving Gojo completely vulnerable, Sukuna fails to finish the job, and I can't in good consciousness put him above Gojo because of this. And that's exactly why coming in at number 1, the strongest domain expansion in all of JJK in my opinion, we have Gojo's domain expansion, Unlimited Void. And I know what you're thinking, oh, didn't you just say that Sukuna won a domain clash twice? How can Gojo possibly be above Sukuna? And you're right. Kinda. See, as explained just before as well, Sukuna would purposely have an open barrier domain expansion that's longer than Gojo's domain expansion so that he could attack it from the outside and shatter it. So, to be honest, I attribute that more to an open barrier domain expansion versus an enclosed one. And to be frank, Unlimited Void is just way more powerful than Malevolent Shrine, and I'm incredibly unapologetic about that. See, Gojo's Unlimited Void instantly incapacitates anyone within it if they're not touching Gojo. As if you're not in contact with Gojo, whole universe's information begins to flood into your brain. Oh, isn't that an insane buff, you might ask? No. It's really not. See, that sheer amount of information being jammed into someone's head makes their brain mushy. For a rough idea of how much information is being jammed into someone's head, when Gojo uses unlimited void for 0.2 seconds in Shibuya, he implements half a year's worth of information into everyone's brain. Because of how much information was being forced into people's brains at the time, non-sorcerers were hospitalized for months. Having that much information jammed into your brain can immobilize you quite easily. And then imagine if you're immobilized for like 1 to 3 seconds at most, just while Gojo cooks up a hollow purple. Now keep in mind, he's within his domain expansion, so it's a guaranteed hit, pretty much making his domain expansion also an instant win condition just by opening it. And yes, Sukuna does win a domain clash twice, but Sukuna couldn't finish the job, and after a couple stalemates in their 5th clash, Gojo got his domain expansion off 0.01 seconds faster. But that 0.01 seconds of unlimited void that hit Sukuna was enough to stun him, let Gojo get a good hit on him, but it also damages Sukuna's brain enough that he's also not able to open a domain expansion anymore, which I think is a perfect display that Gojo has a stronger domain expansion and curse technique abilities, and that Sukuna just had better experience and smarts. And plot armor. But anyways guys, that was all domain expansions ranked and explained. Hope you enjoyed, and if you did, if you could please leave a like, comment anything you'd want to see next, and subscribe to see what is next. Thank you, your mob. Love you.